Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer, and if you're watching us on our YouTube channel, you can also take the Lunch Hour with you wherever you go on one of the many fine podcast platforms that's out there. If you're listening to us on one of those fine podcast platforms, please go and check us out on YouTube. Subscribe, mash down on that like button, leave a comment, send questions. We're always happy to chat with you about whatever we're doing here, and let your friends and families members know all about the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. Very excited to bring our guest on. Her name is Amy Boss. She is the Director of State and Federal Affairs at NetChoice. And as Director of State and Federal Affairs, she works to educate policymakers on key tech issues, including Section 230, content moderation, and antitrust, and advocates for policies that facilitate the continued growth of a free and open internet. Prior to joining NetChoice, she worked for the Internet Association as Director of Government Affairs. She worked up on Capitol Hill for 16 years, mostly for Congressman James Sensenbrenner as his Legislative Director and Judiciary Policy Advisor. She's originally from Michigan, now lives in Fairfax, Virginia. We're going to get into some of her outside interests later on. But let's start here. Not that we need to get into the election, Amy, but obviously we are having a change in administration. One of the things that has to be changed, in your estimation, is what's going on at the FTC. Talk about what's been happening at the FTC over the last few years and why change needs to happen post-haste.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me on. We had an election a couple of weeks ago, and I'm sure when people headed to the ballot box, antitrust wasn't their primary concern.
Sure.
But we are going to see hopefully some changes coming up with the Trump's second term. Let me back up just a minute and
Please.
talk a little bit about what we've seen these past 4 years. And I'll specifically highlight what we've seen coming from the FTC. And that is just a completely aggressive, radical change in antitrust enforcement from prior administrations, right? So we have Lina Khan coming into the FTC. She also worked on Capitol Hill very briefly. She went to Yale Law School, wrote a paper about Amazon and how prices were too low. And now, as chair of FTC, has really gone after some of the biggest and frankly, well-liked companies in the U.S. There's a number of pending cases that the FTC has against Amazon, against Meta. It's been, like I said, a real change from what we've seen from prior administrations. The FTC is supposed to be an independent, bipartisan agency. And what we've seen is really Lina Khan's wish list, going after companies that are in her disfavor, Amazon being the biggest target there. So hopefully, coming up with Trump's second term, we can go back to what has guided antitrust policy for the last 40 plus years, and that is the consumer welfare standard. Crazy standard. This is essentially, it puts consumers first, right? So, when you're looking at mergers and acquisitions, let's focus on, what is best for consumers.
It's interesting because I've talked to folks who are career employees over at FTC, folks who are doing important work over there, and they've been frustrated over the last 4 years. And normally you don't see, the bureaucracy get frustrated with folks who are supposed to be very pro-bureaucracy. But they've seen the FTC move away from its core mission. And worse, this idea of, in many cases, and not for everything, but in many cases, Lina Khan setting up, the way it's supposed to work is you're supposed to see, breaches in the law, and you're supposed to go and build a case for that. But from what I've heard from folks internally is that Lina Khan has an ideological goal in mind, and then she wants to build the facts and apply the law in a way to reach that goal. I mean, is this what you're hearing as well?
Absolutely. And the proof is in the pudding, right? Look at what has happened with the staff under her leadership. They've departed in record numbers. And these are folks that have been at the FTC for decades, and they're leaving because they see an agency that has strayed from its core mission, focusing on consumer fraud, consumers harm. And I would also just say, the courts have been clear on this. She has lost a number of high-profile cases, proving that she doesn't respect, the legal limits of the law.
It's interesting also because this issue of, and we've talked about this with other folks, our colleague Jessica Malugin over at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, as well as others, about the issue of administrative courts and the power that they have. We had the Supreme Court's decision in Jarkissi. We talked with Jarkissi's attorney a few months back. But let's talk about this because you're right. They lose in a fair venue, right? A true venue of justice where they have to present their case. They lose there. But when it comes to their own administrative courts, obviously the deck is stacked in their favor. Talk a little bit about this.
Yeah, we have had mergers and acquisitions that have been challenged by the FTC, which Europeans have gone through. So it's really crazy to think that we're moving in this direction of kind of a European stylized system. One look at Europe's tech leaders and you will realize there really aren't any, right? There's a reason that the U.S. leads on a lot of this stuff. It's essentially because we've had a lighter touch approach on mergers and acquisitions, and I think that's benefited consumers really well, and why we are the leader in this area.
Actually, let's pull it back a little bit, Amy, and let's talk a little bit about the work that NetChoice does. We spend a lot of time on this show talking about innovation and the conditions that get created for innovation. We just did a series on something called the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, talking about America's leadership on innovation and the threats to that. Talk about NetChoice. Talk about the conditions of innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. You know what? Let's start with AI. I think this is something that is really on the horizon, and there's two courses we can go down, two roads we can go down. One being the Biden administration road, where you have a number of regulations. He issued an executive order on artificial intelligence, essentially requiring companies to get permission to innovate. And then you have Trump's approach, which he has pledged to repeal the Biden EO on artificial intelligence, and he wants this technology to thrive. Let's see all the potential that it holds. Sure, do we need to look at certain guardrails? Absolutely, but this heavy-handed approach that the Biden administration has proposed for the last couple of years is not going to be the approach that makes sure that America leads the way. China is right behind us, right? And so I think that's what you hear a lot of Trump saying, is that we need to be our adversaries on this. They're months, not years behind us. They're months behind us. And we're at a really critical juncture here, I think, in leading the world on AI.
It comes back to this issue, and this is something I was literally just talking about with my dad, in terms of sort of regulatory perspective and the issue of risk in public policy. And we have had this adoption. I don't know if you're familiar with the precautionary principle, but this idea of having to prove now, it used to be that you had to sort of demonstrate the risks that were involved in some new invention or some new device. And that would go a long way. Now, under the precautionary principle, you have to somehow prove that something is entirely safe before you let it come to market. And that's just not the way it's supposed to work, is it?
That's exactly right. And it's not the way it's traditionally worked. Right. I really think the Biden administration has distorted, the mission of FTC and DOJ to go after companies who have been successful. Success is not illegal. Being big is not illegal. And you have somebody like Lena Khan at the FTC who is using her bully pulpit to really threaten these companies. And what it tells companies is that, okay, we can't grow and innovate to the degree we want because we might face some scrutiny there. And so you're having people in the boardrooms notice this as well. Maybe they don't go after an acquisition that they normally would. And so that's really disconcerting. And I will just mention, all of this, impacts our pocketbooks as well.
Right.
I saw this morning, NVIDIA's earnings are coming up. Guess what's next on Lena Khan's target list? She wants to take a closer look at NVIDIA. This is something that powers so much, of the industry. And, just that now that they are in her sights, it's very disconcerting. And like I said, it does impact, people's pocketbooks. A lot of folks have 401k stock in NVIDIA, and I think there's a real threat to people in that regard.
This is the conversation that I had with Joe Allen from the Buy Dole Coalition a couple of weeks ago. Like you, spent a lot of time up on the Hill. He worked for Senator Birchby for many years. And the issue, and a lot of folks don't understand this, but the conditions within which people invest in innovation, invest in research and development, this does not happen in a vacuum. And they don't understand the role that uncertainty can play in depressing that desire to innovate. And then, of course, it's not right. As you point out, it's the bottom line, right? Or there's people's pocketbooks in terms of costs. But then it's the jobs that don't get created as a result of all of these things. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, we saw today too, Spirit Airlines now is declaring bankruptcy. They could not merge with JetBlue. So you're seeing layoffs. You can also look at Amazon's acquisition of iRobot. There was a concern, I guess, that Amazon was going to dominate the robot market, and that was denied. And what does iRobot do? They lay off 30% of their staff. So in an era where they could have survived, they could have grown, instead they're laying off workers. And I think that's exactly the opposite of what antitrust law is supposed to do.
Well, yeah, then let's talk about that balance, because obviously, and then I want to get into COSA, the Kids Online Safety Act, because we've spent some time talking about that too. We recognize that there is a role for these regulatory agencies to play, right? Whether it's the EPA or OSHA or the FTC or the FCC or what have you. So how do you guys define the balance between what these agencies need to do in terms of their structure, the communities or persons that they're out there protecting, but also making sure that they don't have the heavy touch that discourages innovation, that discourages investment? Talk about that line.
Yeah, I think it goes back to this whole idea of a consumer welfare standard, which has guided antitrust law for 40 years. It requires enforcers to put the protection of consumers as the chief factor. Right. And that eliminates some of the arbitrary measures here. It guarantees that our government is working to protect consumers and not special interest. There is that balance, but I think if that is your guiding principle, antitrust law isn't perfect, but the alternative could really threaten kind of where our country is headed as far as technology innovation is concerned.
Right. It gets back to, the folks who don't seem to understand that this doesn't happen in a vacuum. And I don't know, again, not that I want to spend all this time talking about Bayh-Dole, but, one of the stories that Joe Allen told was about the issue of, when we were moving from the 1970s into the early 1980s, America was losing ground on the top 10 potential technologies that were out there. America had lost ground on 3, was in danger of losing ground on an additional 5, because the folks engaging in making public policies didn't understand that relationship there. You talked about how China's only months behind us here. It's not just on AI, but it's not just AI. Yeah. Why does the one side not recognize, not understand that this doesn't happen in a vacuum? What are they missing here?
I think look at their background, right? You have folks like Lena Khan. She doesn't have experience in the business sector. She doesn't have experience in the private sector. She doesn't understand, frankly, how business works. And that's why we are, somewhat optimistic that Trump, he's a businessman, right? He's been involved in a lot of, decision making in this regards. And that's why I think we at NetChoice are holding out hope that he can really reverse course here, and focus on economic growth and where technology and innovation can lead us.
Let's bring COSA into this, the Kids Online Safety Act. We had Brian Darling on, as I said, we had Jessica Malugin on to talk about this, a couple of others. Where are you guys? I'm just, my own perspective, not that I need to inject that is, listen, I believe that there are problems out there, but I get very worried when we start giving government agencies greater power in this regard to regulate speech. Where do you guys fall in all of this? What are your thoughts on COSA?
Yeah, so NetChoice, this is a tricky subject, right? We all want to better protect kids online, but it really, to your point, goes to who do we want to entrust in this decision-making process? And what COSA does is creates a duty of care for companies to mitigate certain harms to kids. And folks at the FTC will be in charge of enforcing this law and determining what is and when it is not harmful material. That makes us worried,
Sure.
right? We have argued that parents are in the best position to do this.
Hold on. It's bad enough when the FTC takes existing law and twists it to its own ends. Right. But when you hand them this kind of power explicitly, it goes a long way. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, that's absolutely right. This is a very slippery slope, right? Yeah. The decision making that you leave to Washington as opposed to the decisions you make as a family, and who is best to constitute what is harmful for your child than the parent. And that's not always a message. Parents are overwhelmed with a lot of this stuff. Don't get me wrong. I think you do see some movement. Companies are making more and more parental tools available to them. But it's really scary that you have, and I'll be honest, it's bipartisan, right? It's Democrats and Republicans that have showed support for this legislation. And we need to do a better job of empowering parents and not Washington bureaucrats in this area.
No, I think you're right. So let's get into the substance of what they're talking about. And Bill's gone through a number of different iterations. But the substance of the latest iteration, what would it mean practically? What are we looking at, and how does that also affect the technology world and their investments and what they want to? How does it incentivize or disincentivize things? What are your thoughts here?
So yeah, getting into the substance a little bit more on the bill, because the bill calls on company to mitigate certain harms, whether it's harms related to eating disorders, suicide, things that can affect your mental health. Companies are going to be cautious about that. They are going to want to block content for minors to make sure that they're not on the hook and paying huge fines in this regard. So what does that look like? How do you determine that someone is a minor? What we envision is, essentially showing your ID, having to prove you're a minor, showing a birth certificate, handing over a social security number. There's going to have to be some way where companies are certain that you are an adult or that you are a minor, so they can block that information. So that in and of itself raises a number of privacy concerns too. We know that kids are a primary target of online fraud, of data breaches. You read about a new data breach every week. Right. So handing over additional information to online companies, that's not going to protect kids and actually could make the situation a lot worse.
Right. No, absolutely. And then you get into the disincentives to innovation that happen therein. But this is true generally. Let's turn our attention. I don't know how much you're doing on FCC stuff as well, but all of these things conspire together. We had the greatest growth of internet broadband deployment when we had the lightest touch from the FCC. Now, the last couple of years, we've had it go the other way. And of course, things have been stifled and stymied. This idea of further hamstringing these companies, I mean, that gets, again, back to this issue of innovation. Talk about that.
Yeah, so we at NetChoice, we don't work on a lot of FCC issues, to be quite honest.
Right.
That being said, I think we're very curious to see the administration. Obviously, they've tapped Brendan Carr to lead the FCC in the direction that he takes, but he's been clear that he's very much a free market kind of guy. We're hopeful that he doesn't create unnecessary barriers here too. So yeah, that'll be an interesting issue to watch under the Trump administration as well. Like I said, it's not something that NetChoice has really had a hand in forming. But yeah, the same principles apply to that as well, right? The more regulations, the more red tape that is involved, the less innovation that you have.
Are you guys watching this Department of Government Efficiency? I mean, what are you guys thinking about there? What's on your agenda?
Yeah.
I just put together my list of 100 recommendations on administrative and regulatory issues. What are you guys looking at right now?
I don't think there's going to be any shortage of ways we can trim the fat out of Washington. So, really excited about this, right? Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are co-leading this agency. They're going to take a look at what parts of the budget can be trimmed, can be cut. Speaking of the FTC, I have a few ideas as well. They've spent a lot of money losing in court and are asking Congress to increase their funding. That's absurd when they've strayed from their core mission. But yeah, I think that will be, I worked on Capitol Hill for many years. I saw the bloated budgets that come every single year, and folks have been afraid to, stand up and make those much needed cuts. And I think somebody like Elon Musk, who understands the industry, who, you saw the changes he made at Twitter, now X, and how, he cut, I believe, 75% of the staff there. Everybody was saving their tweets because they thought the company would go under and it was going to be any more. And, so I think, I think there's a lot of potential there. It's something we're going to be keeping a very close eye on. It'll be interesting to see how Musk's relationship with Trump evolves over the next 4 years.
Yeah, I've got thoughts in that regard. Let's talk a little bit about your background. How did you got your BA from Hope College in Holland, Michigan? You came to DC. I mean, what made you come to DC to go and work on the Hill? Talk about that journey a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So came to DC, almost 20 years ago now. I wanted to be part of where the action is at, right? So I started at the very bottom. I started with my hometown congressman as a staff assistant. I really appreciated that role. You're talking directly to constituents. You're going to town halls. You're learning what is at the forefront of voters' minds in that role. And then I worked my way up in his office, became a legislative assistant, legislative director, and really found my niche in the tech policy world.
Sure.
Former Chairman Sensenbrenner was chair of the Judiciary Committee and took a lead role on a lot of these issues. And it's really interesting to see just kind of where we've come since I started in the early 2000s on Capitol Hill to where we are now, where the internet has gone too, right? It was in the infant stages back then. It gets back to kind of that light touch approach, and it's really allowed communities and spaces online to grow. I will say, being a conservative Republican myself, it's really great to see how conservatives have really used their voice online. I think they are absolutely killing it on social media right now, right? It's a new voice for them, as opposed to some of the legacy media where they may not have a voice. And so I get that makes media a little nervous, a little wary because they can't control the narrative. But it's a really exciting time to be a conservative in the tech industry.
Actually, before we talk about some of your outside interests, let's talk about this, and let's talk about the relationship between the size and scope of federal law and how that law can be used against the political opponents. There's obviously a lot of fear about this. I think those fears are overblown. I think when you make steps to shrink the size and scope of federal power, that's the opposite of authoritarianism. Maybe that's just me, but talk about this and whether it's Lena Khan or anybody else, how the size and scope of federal power can be used against an administration's political opponents.
Yeah. Well, one example I will share is the FTC going after Musk, going after X, looking into SpaceX, looking into
Right.
Tesla. It's really been an unprecedented power grab there, demanding documents from the company, often which are outside of the FTC's scope. And I do want to highlight, I mean, we've seen Republicans in the House, led by Chairman Jim Jordan, who has really taken the agency to task on this and has highlighted a lot of the abuses. They've released numerous reports based on the FTC's misguided approach here, and have really called her out. And so that's fantastic to see. Hopefully some of that will carry over into the Trump administration. I think, first on Trump's priority list, really should be replacing Khan at the FTC with a more pragmatic, somebody who understands the business environment. And so we're hopeful that will take place. I will also just say, and I failed to mention this earlier, leading up to the election, look who was on the campaign trail with, Bernie Sanders. It was Lena Khan. Right. So it's clear where she stands on these issues. She's not hiding it. And it's very reflective in the actions the agency has taken.
Sure. Well, let's talk about this. So, my listeners know this, but I feel the need to explain it to my guests. When I was talking about doing a podcast, a new podcast, another podcast, because I do too many, I had conceived of doing something that I was going to call outside interests, which is this idea of folks who are involved in politics and public policy in DC to sort of take some of the mystery out of who they are and what they do, to talk about things that were not political, not public policy oriented, but to talk about their outside interests. You're a Caps fan. I want to hear about that. Concerts that you like going to. What all do you do? What are some of your outside interests?
Yeah. I mean, DC is an interesting town. It has that big city feel, but there's so much to do here, whether it's, concerts, it's the theater. I really enjoy the environment. No one is from Washington, DC, too, which is very unique. We're all from, other states, other towns, small towns, big towns, and we're gathering in this very bizarre place, right? DC is not, it's not like when I go back home to Michigan. It's just a very different environment. You're in a little bit of a bubble.
The Mitten or from the UP?
I am from the Mitten. So I'm from Holland, Michigan. I'm on the lake shore there. And so I find DC just so many opportunities for, various cultural events, which I really appreciate. Again, Caps fan. I enjoy running. I love to do races as well. Really enjoy being outdoors. DC, I'm out in Fairfax, Virginia, about 30 minutes outside of DC. It's a little quieter, the suburbs, which I enjoy. I lived downtown DC for over 10 years, and I think I quite like the suburbs.
Sure. They have their trade-offs. It's funny. I just went to a Caps game, took my older child, who's just gotten their first job in DC. And so that was an experience. Going to go back to a couple of more games, which will be fun. Most recent concert you attended?
Oh gosh, what is the most recent? I saw the Killers at the Anthem.
Excellent.
It's a great venue downtown by what's called the Wharf.
Yeah.
They're a fantastic band. I'm one of those people that likes, to listen to new bands, the smaller venues, 30, 40 people, the intimate show. Love that.
Right.
I'm getting a little too old for, the 10,000. 20,000 audience.
I get it. I like to sit down at a concert. No, I get that as well. Well, actually, it's funny because we're heading into town to see. I don't know if you do theater at all, but Patrick Page is doing all the Devils Are Here at the Shakespeare, and so very, very excited about that. Well, how do folks find out more about the good work that you guys are doing at NetChoice, Amy?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can visit our website, netchoice.org. You can learn about our work on antitrust, on content moderation, on artificial intelligence. We do state and federal affairs. So, oftentimes I think the federal government is a little bit more deliberative, takes its time passing legislation. The states are a whole nother ballgame, right? They see a federal government that doesn't act. They want to get in there and pass their own regulations. So I will say, as concerning as some of the things that we see coming out of Washington, we're seeing the same kind of stuff pop up at the state level too, with the Kids Online Safety Act, with wanting to regulate AI. So a lot of these issues do transcend just the federal government. We'll be active in the states as well on these issues.
Thank you very much for joining us on yet another episode of the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour. Our guest has been Amy Boss. She is the Director of State and Federal Affairs for NetChoice. Go and check that out. As I always say, please, if you like what you're listening to, check us out on YouTube, subscribe, leave a comment, hit that thumbs up, let your friends and family members know all about this. If you're watching us, please check us out on one of those many fine podcast platforms. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. Thank you as always for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.